I cannot say if Miss Lowe was strangled or not, but that possibility exists.
Doctor, based upon your forensic autopsy of Stephanie Lowe, your observations, all the things we've talked about, were you able to come to a conclusion as to cause and or manner of death in this case?
In the framework of criteria in my profession, yes.
And what is that?
Well, there's a specific category in which this, my autopsy and this demise falls, which was defined initially by two physicians. I don't know if I'm going to remember the names. Dr. Matches, I think, is one, M-A-T-C-H-E-S, and Dr. Lew, I think it's L-E-W, and that is homicide by unspecified means. And there are criteria to render that diagnosis.
And what are those criteria, doctor?
In summary, they are suspicious circumstances of the death, no obvious features of lethal physical injury, no lethal natural disease process, no toxicological process that could be causal to death, no heroin or nothing. And lastly, no alternative, quote, reasonable, end quote, explanation for the death.
And in this case, did you observe any indications of a lethal natural cause of death?
No.
In this case, were there suspicious circumstances that were attendant with this death?
Yes.
And those are the things we've talked about?
Yes.
All right. And in this case, the toxicology that was completed recently by NMS indicates what as far as those toxicological results?
That there's nothing lethal in her system. I think she has some evidence that she consumed nicotine before she died, probably smoking, or chewing tobacco, but probably smoking.
Other than that, nothing else?
No.
All right. And no definitive lethal force that you could observe?
At autopsy, that's correct. I could none.
So your opinion then is that is it cause of death or manner of death?
Well, in this case, it's a little blurry because the use of the word homicide relates to a manner of death, and there really isn't a specific cause, hence the term unspecified means. We don't know what happened in this case, and there are other cases like this, usually glorified in the media, but this is homicide by unspecified means, so I don't really have a specific cause.
But your opinion is that the manner of death, at least in this case, is homicide?
Well, it fits according to the diagnostic criteria established by Doctors Matches and Lew for this homicide by unspecified means, which is referred to as homicide by unspecified means.
And that's your opinion?
Well, I'm just following the criteria laid out by other physicians, so I guess, yes, it's my professional diagnosis in this case.
All right. And doctor, just so that it's clear, and I didn't ask about it, but there was no evidence of any gunshot wounds as well, correct?
That's correct.
One last thing, doctor, and I neglected to ask you about it. Was there a discoloration area on the neck of Stephanie Lowe? I believe you referenced in your report a discoloration to the sternocleidomastoid muscle.
Yes.
What is that?
So the sternocleidomastoid muscle is a muscle that is principal in the rotation of the head. So if I look far to the left in this courtroom, this muscle that goes from behind my ear down to the sternum, that's the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So it's one of the muscles of the neck in the front.
Okay. And what would the discoloration in this case come from, if you could tell?
Well, so I sampled that to analyze that under the microscope. The discoloration in general could be one of three things, I guess. Bleeding. It could be decompositional discoloration, or it could be discoloration from something else that's not bleeding or decomposition. And so I sampled that tissue and examined it under the microscope, because extravasation of blood, that is blood that's outside of a vessel, can be identified under the microscope. And I did not see bleeding in that tissue. So it remains as a discoloration. I cannot say that it is bleeding. I don't believe it is.
Not sure what it's from.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Doctor, is your opinion in this case to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as a forensic pathologist?
Yes.
Thank you. One other thing, actually. Is there any indication that, would you be able to tell from your autopsy if Stephanie Lowe was dead before or after she was buried? Any indication she was still alive when she was buried?
The only possible indication would be the irregularity to the fingernails. I have unfortunately encountered cases in which someone is buried alive, and if they are conscious during that process, there's usually some degree of struggle or resistance to being buried. And in that process, there can be injury to the fingernails, but other than that, no.
All right. Likely not the case in this situation?
Probably not.
Okay, thank you. Nothing else.
Yes, sir. Doctor, with your permission, I'm going to stay seated because I got to refer to some things, okay?
Certainly.
You have been in the business of pathology, by way of summary, how many years?
Well, my current position's about 16 years, and then before that in Milwaukee for a year, before that in Virginia for 2 years, and then before that as a trainee under the late Dr. Huntington for another 4 years, so it's more than 20 years.
And been involved in doing pathology for that period of time?
Correct.
These cases for forensic pathology that involve remains, decompensated bodies, they're a unique type of work for you, aren't they, in your field?
Yes.
Why?
Because it takes a special circumstance for an individual to die and not be discovered until they are decomposed. Circumstances such as isolation, if someone lives alone and doesn't communicate with anyone, they can die and not be discovered for a couple weeks, or if someone perishes in a place where no one knows they are, if they're hiking in the mountains and disappear and no one knows where they are. It takes a special circumstance in order for those to come to autopsy.
But what I was talking about is from the forensic pathologist standpoint, the degree of care and commitment to these kind of cases that the forensic pathologist must have.
That it takes well, it's certainly, I'm not really sure what you're getting at, but they're certainly not as easy or straightforward as cases of autopsy on persons who've just passed away.
Yeah, they're not the favorite of the forensic pathologist in general.
Not really, in a typical definition of favoritism, no.
Did you become interested in these kinds of cases at any point in time in your career?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So as a trainee under Dr. Jensen and the late Dr. Teggetts in Milwaukee, I was being trained in forensic pathology with another individual, Dr. Mazrim, M-A-Z-R-I-M. And these cases are well, you know, they're nasty. I don't know what else to say. They smell bad. It's not just a bad smell. The smells can be toxic. There's often insect infestation. You know, they're just bad. And in the first few weeks of my fellowship in Milwaukee, my counterpart, Dr. Mazrim, and I would kind of argue about who's doing the decomposed cases, because my teachers gave us those kind of cases for benefit of the experience. So, for example, we'd come in on a Monday and there'd be a decomposed decedent, and Dr. Jensen says, well, you guys figure out who to do it, and Dr. Masman would say, well, I did 3 last week, and I'd say, well, I did 2 on the weekend, and we would argue to get out of it. And Dr. Jensen pulled us aside and said, look, you guys have to be good at this, because it's not the police or the coroner or the medical examiner that is going to interpret the findings for you. If you're not comfortable with decomposition, it takes away from your skills as a forensic pathologist. And I took that to heart to the degree that I practically pretty much volunteered to do decomposed cases, to the degree that Dr. Jensen would step in and say, hey, Mike, you've done enough decomposed cases, Dr. Masman needs to do them. So at the end of my fellowship, I think I calculated it, approximately 10% of the autopsies I did in my training were decomposed. And I've benefited from that experience in the professional sense.
And over the years, you have continued to be favored by offices across the state to preside over the autopsies of these kinds of cases, correct?
To some degree, yes.
I understood your direct examination to indicate that the decompensation here is, I think you said overall, more moderate overall, right?
Yes.
And that's what you mean by all structures that remain, correct?
And in relation to all the degrees of decomposition that I encounter in my work.
Okay. There was here enough neck and chest tissue and structure remains for you to make certain anatomical conclusions. Agreed?
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about homicide, my unspecified means first, before we get into the autopsy, okay?
Sure.
Right, the people who, or the doctors who found that was Dr. Evan, E-V-A-N, Matches, M-A-T-S-H-E-S, right?
Okay, yes.
And Emma, E-M-M-A, Lew, L-E-W.
Okay.
And this is a diagnosis that doctors Matches and Lew, if I'm pronouncing his name right, determined would be appropriate after careful evaluation of not only the body, but also the crime scene and the overall circumstances, correct?
Yes.
And that includes circumstances for the forensic pathologist who's considering circumstances as communicated by law enforcement, correct?
That's correct.
So circumstances like burial and presence of a knife suggest homicide, right? Now, that's a bad question, I'm sorry. Circumstances like burial and presence of a knife without any autopsy or lab findings indicative of cause of death, homicide by an unspecified means starts to make sense, right?
Yes.
And if I understood correctly, well, let me ask you this. You made the finding here based upon the following facts. I know we're going to talk about the criterion for the medical diagnosis, but I want to talk about the facts that led you to here. You with me?
Yes.
Number one, you were informed that the body was recovered on September 19th, 2014, a couple of days before your autopsy, right?
Yes.
So, and you learned that the body was, or the person was missing since October 10th. So that 4-year period of missing leads you in part to right?
In part, yes.
Right. The recovery from a shallow, non-professional grave in a remote area would lead you to
Correct.
A broken, we talked about this, a broken knife blade recovered near the bodily surface would lead you to correct?
Yes.
You also indicated reportedly engaged in the decedent drug trafficking.
I do make that mention, and in your questioning, if that is a question, I would place emphasis on reportedly. I have no specific knowledge personally of the activities of Miss Lowe.
But would reported drug trafficking contribute to the HUM diagnosis?
I did not consider that.
Okay.
In the hum, no.
Okay. If the broken knife was not found on the body, if you can answer this, on the surface of the body, would this, based on all your work in this case, would this still be a HUM diagnosis, you think?
Yes.
Because of the other suspicious circumstances, correct?
The grave. Concealment of remains is suspicious.
All right. We get into a little bit of the autopsy now. I'm mindful of the time, Your Honor. We're going to get into some specifics of the autopsy now, and I'm going to go by parts of body. And let's talk about the two, I think you've labeled them, probable contusions to scalp. I'm looking at page 5, Doctor.
Yes.
And we've got that right frontotemporal region discoloration that you say suggests bruising, right?
Yes.
And then you've got, I want to talk to you about this other one. You've got this one you said was the tear, because it's a laceration, between the side of the head and the back of the head. You with me?
Yes.
That results in a scalp, you see a scalp laceration, but with associated discoloration on the surface of the skull bone, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, either one or both of these aren't really subtle injuries, are they? That was some significant injury, wasn't it?
Well, one is 5 centimeters, which is 2 inches, and the other is 10, which is 4 inches. So no, they're not pinpricks, no.
Right, but with that discoloration on the surface of the skull, that's a fair amount of trauma, isn't it?
Well, it's a lesion. I'd rather say that.
Okay. Well, look, it's not associated with sharp force injury, either of those, right?
Correct.
But would it be consistent with like a head hitting the floor or steps or like hard surfaces while a body is being transported?
That's possible.
Okay. Again, these two head injuries. You can't tell whether they're pre or post.
That's true.
I thought I remember recalling that those weren't just bumps in the night, right?
Well, I don't know what you mean.
Well, I mean, those don't look like those could be accidental, somebody hitting their head on a wall. I thought they were more severe with some force.
Well, look, people can fall over from standing up and it's cracked their skull. So, I mean, bumps in the night, I guess, is possible.
Okay. All right. I understand. Let's get to the neck. Okay. I'm looking now at page 6, some language. The subcutaneous tissue of the neck is without sharp force injury, right?
Yes.
All right. And when you talk about neck in your nomenclature in the autopsy, is it, what we typically think about the neck, or is it just the front?
It's principally the front and the sides.
Okay. That extends from what? The larynx all the way to like the ear area?
Well, the neck is actually circumferential. It goes around the whole base of the skull, but I think what you're getting at, the neck is really from the base of the skull to the upper part of the torso. That's the neck.
Got it. Okay. All right. The area from the neck towards the shoulder, let's say in between those areas, what's that called?
I call it the area between the neck and the shoulder.
Okay. Okay.
So I don't know that there's a specific term for that, is what I'm getting at.
Let me just jump to that. Did you see any trauma or did you see any sharp force injury to that area?
I have really no definitive sharp force injury anywhere other than possible to the ventral aspect of the left wrist.
Okay. Now, when you say subcutaneous tissue of the neck is without sharp force injury, you then conclude no lethal sharp force injury found macroscopically. Is that you just saying the same thing there?
Basically.
Okay. This subtle area of discoloration, measuring approximately 2 centimeters on the left sternocleidomastoid muscle. You with me?
Yes.
All right. You noted that and wanted to do a little bit more work with that.
Yes.
All right. And that's because of what was reported to you about the alleged circumstances of this woman's demise, correct?
No.
Okay,
No.
why did you do that then?
I pretty much routinely do that. If I have a discoloration on the neck of someone, another one, tomorrow, I will sample that and subject it to microscopy. I do use the microscope routinely.
All right. And did that involve you looking at some underlying tissues of that muscle?
It involves specifically looking at that area of discoloration to see if the discoloration is truly from bleeding or from non-bleeding.
Because if it was from bleeding, it would suggest strangulation or other trauma, correct?
It would suggest trauma.
All right. And what did you find when you did some further dissection of that tissue area?
It's not bleeding.
But even if you see absolutely no trauma whatsoever to a neck area, you didn't even see that discoloration on the left side, you still couldn't rule out strangulation, could you?
That's true. It'd still be strangulation. Yes.
Can't rule it out.
That's correct.
Just like you couldn't rule out drowning, right?
That's true.
You couldn't rule out something called, what, burping, where somebody sits on somebody's chest, right?
That's true.
You
Yes.
couldn't rule out seizure disorder.
That's true.
But we know that this discoloration on the sternocleidomastoid muscle without any bleeding subcutaneous, you with me?
Yes.
There was no other associated area of neck muscle trauma, right?
Well, the discoloration, I'm not going to call trauma under oath.
Right.
There is no trauma to the neck that I could identify.
The hyoid bone. What is that?
It's a U-shaped bone in the front of the neck that is sometimes fractured in strangulation.
It was removed here,
Yes,
and it was determined to be without any antemortem injury.
that's correct.
The tracheolaryngeal skeleton, I'm probably mispronouncing that. How do you say it?
Tracheolaryngeal.
Skeleton, correct?
Yes,
Did you give that a look?
yes.
Where's that?
That's the other rigid structures of the neck that can be fractured in some cases of strangulation.
When you took a look, was it intact and without fracture?
Yes.
What's the pharynx?
The pharynx is the posterior aspect of the mouth or the throat. It's the inlet to basically the airway and the esophagus, which leads to the stomach.
Unobstructed?
Yes.
Would you, if a person was strangulated, as you indicated on direct examination, by somebody who knew how to do it without leaving any trauma, how's that we talked about, right?
Sure.
Would you expect to see an unobstructed pharynx?
Yes.
You still could.
Yes, strangulation and obstruction of the pharynx are two completely different things.
Okay. What about tongue without bite marks? Was that significant here at all?
Not really.
Okay. Now, let me just ask you a couple of conclusory questions, okay?
Sure.
On the neck question. Were there sufficient remains of the neck for you to determine there was no anatomical support for a claim a knife was plunged into the neck with such force that it could break?
I have no definitive evidence of sharp force or knife injury to the neck.
And we already covered the chest, right?
Yes.
No way. Nothing.
Nothing to the chest. Unless it's something superficial, which would imply a lesser force to cause fracture of a blade. If it's a superficial cut, then I would not expect that a cut sustained superficially to cause fracture of a metallic blade.
No definitive genital trauma was observed, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Just coming to the end, doctor, okay?
Sure.
Doctors Mashies and Liu, how many, I trust you do, I read this, also have kind of a variation on hum, such as homicidal violence including X being like blunt chest trauma. You with me?
Yes.
All right. So you've got, as possible diagnosis in your field, simple homicide by unspecified means, right?
Yes.
And then there's another diagnosis, which is homicidal violence including something else, right?
Yes.
You could have chosen here, doctor, if I understand all your testimony, to diagnose, instead of homicidal violence including chest trauma, right? You could have done that, but there was no evidence of it.
No, if there's no chest trauma, I wouldn't say there is. So I wouldn't have chosen homicidal violence based on chest trauma because there is no chest trauma.
And you couldn't, and you didn't opine homicidal violence including neck trauma, right?
There's no neck trauma.
You didn't include homicidal violence.
Your Honor, I guess I'm going to object at this point in time. I think this is getting repetitive, and the doctor has indicated already, he has the diagnosis. I think we could probably go through every single potential area and say you didn't diagnose this, but I think it's getting a little repetitive.
Well, I've concentrated on two areas that remain in the case, and I got one last question.
Okay, ask your final question.
Homicidal violence by trauma to that area between the neck and shoulder, you didn't opine that.
I don't have trauma to the neck and shoulder, or to the shoulder or the neck, no.
I have no further questions.
Any brief, Director?
Yes, it's very brief, Your Honor. I think that way we can get Dr. Stier back to Madison. Dr. Stier, were you also aware that Ms. Lowe had disappeared from a residence and that there was blood and a cleanup at the residence when she disappeared?
I don't know if I was aware of that at the time that I did the examination, and I'm not sure that it really doesn't play a role in my interpretation of my findings.
Okay, that's fine. That's fair enough. I was going to ask if that played any role. The two head injuries that you observed, are either one of those sufficient to be fatal injuries?
Well,
In your opinion?
I don't know if they're after death or before death, because it is possible to sustain injury after death and have some bleeding just by force of gravity. It's a myth, that people can't bleed after they die. They can, and particularly the scalp.
Okay. But assuming that they were antemortem, would they be sufficient to be lethal? In your opinion? Like that?
Maybe.
Possible, okay. And Doctor, you were asked about drowning. Was there any evidence that would be supportive of drowning in this case?
No.
All right. Would you have expected to see fluid in the lungs if this was drowning?
Sometimes there are persons who drown that don't have significant fluid in the lungs, the so-called, quote, dry drowning, end quote. So in many cases of drowning, there is fluid in the lungs, and in some cases there is very little fluid in the lungs, and in many cases of non-drowning deaths, there is fluid in the lungs.
Okay. But there was no fluid in the lungs in this
No.
case? All right. And Doctor, could the knife have been fractured as it was struck on something where the person was acting in a defensive posture? without causing a significant sharp force injury to the chest or some other area?
That's possible.
And if Stephanie had died of a seizure disorder, you would have expected her to have some medical history of seizure disorder, correct?
I would have expected that.
And are you aware of any?
No.
Thank you, that's all that I've got.
Just a clarification. I mean, this seizure disorder and this drowning and burping, that's just another example of what homicide by unspecified means is, right?
Not
You can't rule that out.
No, well, that's part of this diagnostic category, but seizure can be fatal. I do autopsies on persons who die from seizure routinely. However, a diagnosis of seizure fatality is also somewhat exclusionary. That is, no specific evidence of cause of death, and someone states, a coroner or a death investigator, oh, by the way, Mr. So-and-so has epilepsy, then it's a seizure fatality. So seizure is not something that can be proven at autopsy alone.
But what I'm getting at is, assuming that this poor woman wasn't drowned, you with me? There's as much evidence of drowning in this case as there is of strangulation, correct? Because it's a hum.
There is no evidence for either drowning or strangulation.
Same amount. Right?
Yes.
I have nothing for...
Okay. Is he released from the subpoena?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let's start back again at 1:15.
Hello?
Good afternoon, Mr. Ison. Could you state your name for the record, please? Could you tell us your name?
My name's Harold Ison, but everybody calls me Rocky.
Could you spell your last name?
ISON.
And, Mr. Ison, where do you live?
Currently I live in Madison, Wisconsin.
Are you familiar with Yvonne, also known as Bonnie
Oh,
Wadinski?
absolutely.
How
I've
do you
been,
know her?
well, I lived with her family off and on for over 40 years. Just casual, good people, that's all. Nothing,
And, Mr. Ison, do you recall in 2010 doing some work on Bonnie's cabin?
well, it was on her shed by what we call a secondary shack.
Okay. And did you take some pictures and post them to Facebook of the work that you were doing on that cabin?
Yes, sir,
That was checked.
yes, sir, I did.
May I approach, Your Honor?
May.
70 and 71. I'm showing you, Mr. Ison, what was previously been marked for identification as Exhibits 70 and 71. Are those the photos that you posted on Facebook?
Yeah,
Is that a yes?
yes, sir.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
That's okay. I want you to make sure.
Well, I know I haven't.
Okay, if I publish, Your Honor?
have a speech thing.
It may.
All right.
All kinds of.
So, Mr. Ison, looking behind you on the screen up there, is that one of the photos that you posted?
Anybody else see it? You see it?
All right, and this one here, is that one of the photos that you posted showing a boat? Why don't you sit down, and you got to speak into the microphone, is that a yes?
Yes,
Okay. And did you post those shortly after you took those photos?
yes,
All right. And I believe it has already been admitted that they were posted on October 11th of 2010. Would you have taken them within a day of that?
I believe so.
Thank you.
Can I explain my purpose behind?
the reason for posting it isn't really that important. We just want to be sure that they were posted. and
Okay.
That you took them. Do you remember a vehicle coming up to the area while you were working in the cabin?
Yeah, but I didn't connect it with the boat.
Okay.
But yes, what happened was they went down and there's other properties there, private properties, but it might be tribal too, because that's the reservation.
Okay.
And so what happened was I seen him out of the corner of my eye and I looked up because I didn't want to fall down through the hole that I had created to repair the roof. I was in between some rafters like. And so I have to keep, and then there's a cliff in the back too, drops 12 feet. And then there's a slope for about 30 feet and then it hits a creek. If I left that roof, I would it had been a challenge to get up and walk at the bottom.
All right. And the boat, had you been there the day before?
Yes, sir.
Was the boat there the day before?
The day before, the boat wasn't
All
there.
right, so it just showed up on the date. Okay, that's all the questions I have.
Yes.
I have no questions, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, be careful.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
He may be released, yes.
Thank you.
Follow that definition.
State would, I'm going to recall Claudia Blake very briefly, Your Honor.
Go ahead. I swear, yeah.
I'm sorry. You raise your hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony will give you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
I've asked for permission to publish Exhibit 256, which you previously had been. I just want to ask you a couple questions about that. Claudia, I'm showing you what was previously marked and admitted as Exhibit 256. Were you familiar with the keychain that your daughter Stephanie had?
Yes.
Is this keychain that's depicted on Exhibit 256, is that similar to a keychain your daughter had?
Yes.
One other question, Claudia. Did your daughter Stephanie, to your knowledge, have any seizure disorders?
No.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
No questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brown.
State would now call Detective Jennifer Pulse, Your Honor.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony will give you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
Could you state your name for the record, please, and spell your last name for the court reporter?
Jennifer Holtz, Holz.
How are you employed there?
I'm a detective with the Wausau Police Department,
How long have you been employed with the Wausau Police Department?
16 years,
And how long have you been a detective?
6 years.
And what did you do before you were a detective?
I spent 5 years on patrol and 5 years in the drug unit.
And in the drug unit, was that mainly investigations?
Yes.
So you spent about the last 11 years doing mainly investigations?
Yes.
And since you've been assigned as a detective, what types of cases do you handle?
We're all general detectives, but I inherited the Stephanie Lowe investigation on October 10th, 2011 from now Captain Matthew Barnes.
And have you been working on that case since then?
Yes.
Has that taken up a lot of your time?
Yes.
Let's talk about some of the early things that you did. Did you get a chance to review phone records?
I did.
And what phone records did you have a chance to review?
The phone records of Stephanie Lowe, phone records of Eric Mahomes, phone records of Kristopher Torgerson, and eventually of Andrea Wadinsky.
And we've had previously marked and admitted a diagram. I'm not going to bother to put it up, but actually I think I will, because we're going to talk about these a little bit. What was previously marked as exhibit number 234 and admitted is a chart with a number of phone numbers on it. Are you familiar with those phone numbers?
Yes, sir.
All right. And those are the phone numbers that you were familiar with that became relevant to this investigation?
Yes.
Now, did you review, you said you reviewed the records of, the phone records of Stephanie Lowe?
Yes.
And did you review the records that are contained in Exhibit 221, the stipulation as it relates to the phone records?
Yes.
And did you look to see how regular a user of her cell phone Stephanie Lowe was in the time leading up to her disappearance and murder on October 10th of 2010?
Yes, she appeared to be very active on her cell phone.
And did there come a time when that ended?
Yes.
Approximately what time was the last outgoing call that you noted from her cell phone?
12:58 a.m. on October 10th, 2010.
Prior to that, how regular was the phone use for that night?
Again, very regular.
And who was that call to, by the way, if you recall?
Kelly Wilborn.
Did you also review the phone calls and messages between Ms. Lowe, or from Cassie Miller?
Yes.
And it appears that she made a number of calls, 4 total calls in the early morning hours of October 10th?
Correct.
And it appeared to have started at about 2:16 a.m.?
Correct.
Did you also review the records of Eric Mahomes?
I did.
And Eric was in jail as of October 9th and early morning of October 10th?
Yes.
But there were still some calls, it appears, on his phone, correct?
Yes.
And were you able to find a call that went from that went to Eric Mahomes' phone that was while Stephanie Lowe was on her cell phone?
Yes.
And who was she on her cell phone with when that call came in on Mr. Mahomes' phone?
Elissa Clendenning.
And who was the call from that came in on Eric Mahomes' phone?
Kristopher Torgerson.
The defendant in this case.
Yes.
Were there other calls on the night of October 9th, and we'll talk about October 10th a little later, but October 9th from the defendant's phone to Eric Mahomes' phone?
Yes.
When was the next call, or when was the other call that went from the defendant's phone to Eric Mahomes' phone?
I believe it was 11:57 p.m.
Yeah, Court, Your Honor. Just so that the record's clear, and I realize you're testifying from memory here, I'm showing you what was previously marked as Exhibit 221 stipulation. The top call in there is one from the defendant's phone, correct?
Yeah.
The 846-5025 to Eric Mahomes' phone, correct?
Right.
And what is the time?
23:47:24.
So 11:47 rather than 57.
Correct.
All right. Now, were there some more calls from the defendant's phone to Eric Mahomes' phone?
Yes,
And was that a series of calls?
yes,
And that would have been in the early morning hours,
correct.
starting around 3:46 a.m.
Yes,
and going periodically till around a little after 4:30.
yes.
Were they all dialed the same way?
No, they were not.
How were some of them dialed?
Some were dialed 1-715-212-8209. Others were dialed 715-212-8209.
I'll object, move to strike, facts not in evidence based on prior testimony of Mr. Ferrelli. Do you recall?
Go with the call.
Your Honor, I believe that she can testify to what she observed, what she understands of how the phone records work. Mr. Ferrelli's testimony was he didn't know if that meant they were dialed differently or not.
So this witness has firsthand knowledge of the physical buttons that were pushed, as I understand it? When the phone witness testified, that can't be determined. Is that where we're at?
I'm going to let her answer.
Okay.
We sought that answer from Airdyne Communications and received a response from them.
When I move to strike, hearsay.
I believe it's part of a business record, Your Honor, which would be an exception.
It's information about utilization of the buttons on a phone, not business records.
Okay, I'll sustain the objection.
And move to strike the answer, sir.
Which answer is that?
Pardon me, sir?
And what's the answer? Which part of her do you want struck?
The last answer to the question.
Okay, that is, we sought that answer from Airdyne Communications, received a response from them. Okay, that's where it's struck.
I believe the prior answer, too, should be stricken as well.
And I don't have that.
Well, I'd ask it be read back. I'll tell you what, Judge, we'll just move along. I've received enough relief sufficient to move on.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Let's just take a look at the records themselves. Now, you had a chance to review the records, correct?
Yes,
And those included the defendant's call logs, correct?
yes,
That published, Your Honor?
Okay.
Showing, reviewing, there's a calling party number at 34632. Do you see that one?
yes,
And calling party is the defendant's phone number, correct?
correct.
Call number is 1-715-302-0849, correct?
Yes,
And that is Eric Mahone, or 8209. I'm sorry, that's 0849. I'm sorry, I remember the wrong one. The next one down is 715-212-8209, correct?
yes,
And that's at 34657, correct?
yes,
And the next one is again from the defendant's phone number, correct?
yes,
And that one is it lists it as 1-715-212-8209, correct?
yes,
And that is at 34722, correct?
yes,
And it shows, if we look to the side here, for those, the same tower information for those two calls, correct?
yes,
The next entry after that is another entry for a different number, and then we go down a couple more, and our next call is at 3:55 and 35 seconds.
Yes.
And that one appears to be, again, to the 1-715-212-8209, correct?
Yes.
And again appears to be another teller in the Wausau area that was identified by Mr. Ferrelli, correct?
Yes.
Next entry after that at 3:55:59, same teller information as the previous call, correct?
Yes.
And again, from the defendant's phone to Mr. Mahomes' phone, but without the 1, correct?
Yes.
And then the next call, again, the exact same teller information, correct?
Yes.
4:32 a.m. and to just 715-01, correct?
Yes.
And finally, the last entry that we've got on these series, which is at 4:33, is to, again, the 1-715, correct?
Yes.
It appears to be the exact same teller again, the 11C, correct?
Yes.
And you were present when Mr. Ferrelli said it could be, what his understanding was, the reason why it might be different might be because it was a different out-of area.
Correct.
Clearly, those were all in the same area, correct?
Yes.
All from the same towers in the Wausau area.
Yes.
Are you familiar from your own use if you need to dial a 1 when you're dialing from a cell phone number typically?
Not if it's local. That put your,
You may.
this is 260 and this is 2, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't give you, thought I gave you two different things. This one should be 261, I'm sorry. Got the wrong thing. Showing you, Detective Holt was marked as Exhibit 260. Is this additional records you obtained from Air Fire as
Yes.
part of their business records?
Yes.
All right. And 260 contains information on a call that was received to Air Fire on October 13th of 2010,
Yes.
and a request for information about call logs, correct?
Yes.
And that was on the account of relating to either the defendant or Andrea Wadinsky, correct?
Yes.
Move the admission of Exhibit 260, Your Honor.
No objection. It is received.
And may I approach you again, Your Honor?
You may.
Showing you what has been marked for identification as Exhibit 261. Can you tell me what that is?
This is a phone scoop printout of a Samsung SGH8237 cell phone.
And from the records you obtained from Aerodyne, was that the type of phone that the defendant was, Aerodyne Air Fire, the type of phone that the defendant had at the time of October 10th, 2010?
According to the defendant's account notes, someone called inquiring or eliciting information about this cell phone, or that they had changed to this particular brand cell phone.
Move the admission of Exhibit 261, Your Honor.
I'll object. I don't know if there's been sufficient foundation as to which phone, whose phone this is. I have a picture from a website. So I object.
Should be a court.
Your Honor, I believe the information is that Airfire was asked about the phone. Well, let me ask a couple other questions. Was that in relation to the defendant's account?
Yes.
And that the phone was, what was the information that Airfire had on their records that were provided as it related to that phone and the defendant's account?
On September 25th, 2010, a customer called related to this phone line inquiring about this particular phone.
What did they inquire about it?
I believe they requested the OTA settings, which should be on the account notes.
Okay, now that was Exhibit 260. Here's Exhibit 260. Can you tell us what those account notes show about that phone?
These are really small. On September 25th, 2010, at 1500 hours, customer needed OTA settings for A237 Samsung phone with Andrea Wadinsky and then her address on White Spire Road.
And is your understanding that that would be required to use that phone on the Airfire system?
Yes.
I believe there is sufficient foundation, Your Honor, as submission of Exhibit 261.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Overruled is received.
And that was September of 2010, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. As part of the investigation, were you also able to determine or have the cell phone number for Clark Prosser's number at that time?
Yes.
And what was that?
I don't recall it off the top of my head.
All right. If you saw it on the records, would that refresh your memory?
Yes, it would.
So let's take a look at Stephanie Lowe's phone records from the afternoon of October 10th. She was receiving a number of calls that afternoon, correct?
Yes.
Not making.
Correct.
I believe we had in the testimony that Shelley Resch had a landline as of that point in time, correct?
Correct. I believe it was a 298 number.
The what?
A 298 number.
298-0682, correct?
Yeah, that sounds right.
And looking here, we have calls from that number, her landline, it appears around 3:30 in the afternoon.
Yes.
All right. And do you see a number that you recognize as being Clark Prosser's number near that?
I do.
And what is that number?
715-571-9397.
All right. And there are calls from that 9397 number around that same time as the Shelley Resch calls, correct?
Correct, at 1537-42.
All right. And then from Shelley Resch's, it looks like it's at 1543-41.
Yes.
All right. That would be consistent with what they said about being together and trying to call Stephanie Lowe's number together to try and find her.
Yes.
Now, you're familiar with the location of the apartment at 701.5 West Thomas Street?
Yes.
Have you ever actually been inside of that apartment?
I've not. I've been to the door, and that's it.
All right. You've been to the location itself numerous times.
Yes.
All right. And can you tell us if that apartment is located in the city of Wausau?
Yes, it is.
Is it located in Marathon County?
Yes, it
And
is.
is it located in the state of Wisconsin?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Now, Detective Holt, have you had contact with the defendant in this case?
Yes.
And fair to say a number of times?
Yes.
When was the first time you had contact with him, if you recall?
I know he was interviewed by Detective Buckner and Lieutenant Cole in November of 2011, and he was interviewed by myself and Lieutenant Cole in December of 2011.
And was that December 2011 interview with Lieutenant Cole the first contact you had with him?
Yes.
And I think we'll hear a little more about that interview when Lieutenant Cole testifies later. At that point in time, around December of 2011, had there been interviews of individuals that tied the defendant to Stephanie Lowe and her disappearance, her murder, and her burial?
Yes.
And were those people that you had talked, some of those people you had talked to,
Yes.
and other detectives had talked to others as well, correct?
Yes.
Based on that, were you also trying to get additional information from Andrea Wadinsky?
Yes.
And why is that?
Because information was being gathered that she was perhaps involved in some way.
Okay. And did you also have information at that point in time about Richard Hawkins?
Yes, eventually.
And were you taking actions to try to identify him?
Yes.
Did you ask the defendant about him? You were Lieutenant Cole in the interview on December 21st of 2011.
Yes.
Did you ask the defendant what Mr. Hawkins' name was?
Yes.
Full name. What did he say?
I don't believe he recalled. I believe he referred to him as a different last name in possibly a prior interview with Detective Buckner and Lieutenant Cole.
Okay.
But as I recall, he could not recall Rich's last name.
So when you talked to him, he couldn't tell you anything about his last name?
No.
Did you, at some point in time, talk to the defendant about shoes that he was wearing?
Yes.
Had you, by this point in time, obtained and reviewed various surveillance video from a lot of different places?
Yes.
Did you review all of that surveillance video?
I did.
How many hours is that?
It took several months.
And among those was surveillance video from a Quick Trip, correct?
Yes.
Actually, two that became important, correct?
Yes.
Which locations of Quick Trip did you review that became important?
There is a Quick Trip located at East Wausau Avenue and North 6th Street in the city of Wausau, which is near Breakaway. And there used to be a second location of Quick Trip on Grand Avenue in the city of Wausau. That's no longer there.
And those two both had surveillance video that became significant. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to publish exhibits 91 and 92, which have previously been admitted, and ask a couple questions about them.
Go ahead.
Showing you what was previously marked and admitted as Exhibit 91. That, to your knowledge, the defendant?
Yes.
All right. And do you notice the shoes that he's wearing?
Yes.
And did you take note of those as part of what you were reviewing in this case and investigating in this case?
His shoes, his pants, his shirt, yes, everything.
And showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 92, is that a little bit better picture of what appear to be the same shoes?
Yes.
And again, you took note of that as well as the other clothes that the defendant is wearing?
Yes.
Did you do anything to try to find those shoes and those clothes?
I did.
What did you do?
We went to Andrea Wodinsky's residence and searched Kristopher Torgerson's closet with her permission. Could not locate the shirt or the shoes. We did take several pairs of his jeans that were entered into evidence. In addition to that, we later conducted search warrants on the defendant's storage units, where we looked again at his clothing and his shoes, and we were never able to locate the shirt or the shoes that he's seen wearing in those photographs.
May I approach your honor?
You may.
I'm going to show you what have been marked for identification as exhibits 94, 95, and 96. I want to ask you a couple, I just want you to tell me if you recognize those photos first off, and then I'm going to publish them and ask you some questions about them with the court's permission.
Yes, I recognize these.
May I publish your honor and ask questions about them?
Yes.
Showing you, I'm going to have to zoom out, I believe. What has been marked for identification as Exhibit 94. Can you tell me what that is?
These photos are a series of pictures of the defendant's shoe collection.
Did he have a lot of shoes?
He had a lot of shoes.
He was a shoe person.
He was a shoe person.
All right. And did you examine all of these, the shoes that are shown in Exhibit 94?
Yes.
All right. Were any of those a match for the shoes that were contained or shown on Exhibits 90 and 91?
No, they were not.
Move admission of Exhibit 90, I'm sorry, it was 91 and 92. Move for the admission of Exhibit 94, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No.
It'll be received.
Showing you what has been marked for identification as Exhibit 95. Can you tell me what this is?
It's another photograph of the defendant's shoe collection,
And
showing different shoes, obviously.
any of these shoes a match for the shoes shown in Exhibit 91 or 92?
No.
With the admission of Exhibit 95, Your Honor.
No objection.
It's received.
And finally, showing you what has been marked for identification as Exhibit 96. Is this still some more shoes?
Yes.
And did you check them to see if any of them were a match for the shoes that the defendant was wearing the early morning hours of October 10th, 2010?
Yes, I did check, and they were not.
With the admission of Exhibit 96.
No objection.
Received.
Did you ever find any shoes in the defendant's possession that matched the shoes shown in Exhibits 91 and 92?
No.
Did you ever find a shirt that matched the description of the shirt in Exhibit 91?
No.
That's the shirt at the first Quick Trip, the one on Wausau,
Correct, the striped polo.
Now, as the investigation went on, did you contact Airfire again about their records that they might have?
I did.
Did you try to find out if they had records showing cell tower information for text messages?
Yes.
The initial records you got did not have that, correct?
Correct.
And were you able to then obtain cell tower information for text messages sent by both Andrea Wodinsky and the defendant?
Yes.
And once you obtained those, did that show you something that you thought was significant and important?
Yes.
What did it show you?
That showed that Andrea Wodinsky was in fact in the Anago area on October 10th, 2010 in the early morning hours, which would not be consistent with her previous statement.
And that, in fact, was a text message at about 10:53 a.m.?
Yes.
All right, and that was previously testified to by Mr. Farrell, correct?
Yes.
And did you, based upon that information, contact Ms. Wadinsky before,
I did.
and you confronted her with that, correct?
I did.
And once you did that, she was basically, after a period of time, confirmed and essentially broke and told you what had happened, correct?
Eventually,
Well, that's a
yeah.
characterization of the statement, so I'll move to strike, and I object. Andrea, I think the witness can testify Andrea Wadinsky subsequently made statements that were different.
Okay, sustained.
All right. She eventually told you during the course of that interview, which was on February 12th, 2013, what happened, correct?
Yes.
And what she told you in that interview, can you tell the jury whether or not it is essentially consistent with what she testified to here in court yesterday?
Yes, it is.
Judge, I'll object and move to strike. I don't think that's proper testimony. I think that's a question for the jury, not for this witness to comment on the consistency of earlier testimony with prior statements.
Your Honor, I believe it is appropriate. I believe, and we can make argument if you, the court wishes.
That's fine. I'm going to overrule the objection.
Thank you. Now, we heard a lot of questions during the course of the cross-examination of Ms. Wadinsky about a drug investigation. Do you recall that?
Yes.
All right. And were you involved in that drug investigation?
Yes.
And that was with Agent Fulton and a bunch of other investigators, correct?
Correct.
Are you aware if anybody was ever charged in that drug investigation?
I am aware.
Objection irrelevant.
Well, I believe it is, Your Honor. Count. Again, I can...
Overruled.
All right. Thank you.
I am aware that nobody was ever charged in relation to that drug investigation.
That includes the defendant,
Correct.
and includes Ms. Wadinsky,
Correct.
and includes anybody else.
Correct.
Were you eventually able to identify Richard Hawkins?
Yes.
And you and Lieutenant Cole went to California to meet with him,
Yes.
and then he came back here to Wisconsin.
Correct.
There's been some questions about a meeting that took place where Ms. Wadinsky and Mr. Hawkins met together. Do you recall those questions?
As it relates to us speaking to Mr. Hawkins in California?
Correct. Well, not that, but when Mr. Hawkins was back here, where they actually physically met and were together. Do you recall that?
Correct. In October of 2013?
And can you explain to the jury why that happened?
Sure. At that point in the investigation, our main goal was to bring Stephanie home to her family. We didn't have enough information to do that. Mr. Hawkins and Ms. Wadinsky had tried on several occasions to lead us to the location of her body to the best of their recollection, but they were unable to do so. At that point, we didn't have enough to charge anybody. We didn't know where Stephanie was. We didn't know what had happened to her. We had strong suspicions at that point, but we basically were at a dead end in the investigation. We had nothing to lose by getting them together, and the point of that was essentially to see if they could help each other recall any bit of information that would help us try to find Stephanie.
After they met and after they talked together and after that date, did either of them change what they were saying about what happened the night of October 9th or the early morning or the morning hours of October 10th of 2010?
Essentially, no. Essentially, there's still, we still have Rich saying that they stopped and had a beer. He still sticks by that, even though Andrea does not recall that. So there are portions of their story, even though we did get them together for that brief period of time, that are different.
And did either one of them change any aspect of what they said about what happened as a result of that meeting?
No.
when you went up to Wabeno, or actually, did you go up to Wabeno with them?
Yes.
And when you got up to Wabeno, what did you do when you got up there?
Which time?
Well, let's just talk about the first time with Rich. What did you do?
The first time with Rich, we simply drove up there with him, and I believe, if I recall, there was snow on the ground, which incidentally he had never seen. So he tried to recall as best he could where Stephanie might be, and he just couldn't recall. He pointed us down a couple of different forest roads. He gave us a very vivid description of, the defendant backing a Jeep into a clearing. He talked about a vehicle driving past them as they were attempting to bury Stephanie or dig that hole. He was giving us general ideas of places that looked familiar, but he was simply not able to pinpoint an exact location.
On this one. What's that area like where you were and these forest roads that you talked about?
It's a national forest. The forest roads are essentially gravel, if at all, similar to like an ATV trail in some places.
Dr. Paulson, I'm putting up here what has been marked for identification as exhibit number 262. Can you tell me what this is?
That is the location of where Stephanie Lowe's body was eventually located.
Okay. And it shows, it appears, if I can point here, actually, why don't I, yeah. I'll have you actually go and grab the laser pointer and we'll get that going here. I want you to, if you can on there, point out to the jury. It's the area that you're talking about, that's this forest. Activate the laser, just push this center button right there. So do you see the forest road on here?
Yes.
All right. And can you just point it out for us?
The road itself?
All right. And so for the record, it's on a diagonal, kind of dissecting the middle of Exhibit 262. Would that be fair, counsel?
Yes, sir.
All right. And where approximately, and I know we're kind of jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit, where approximately was Stephanie Lowe's body found eventually?
She was eventually located right in this area right here.
Okay, and that would be an area a little bit to the left of the center of the Exhibit 262.
Agreed.
There again? All right. Now, this appears to be a fairly wooded area.
Yes.
All right. And you said there was a second forest road?
Yes.
Can you tell us, was it similar to this as far as how it looked?
It was similar to that, however, the second forest road was much shorter. It was approximately 3/4 of a mile in length, and this one is much longer.
Okay. And was Mr. Hawkins able to determine which of the two forest roads they went on when the body was buried?
In him showing us both of the forest roads, he seemed to favor the other. So that's where we ended up focusing our efforts with him.
Okay. But it turned out it actually was this forest road.
Correct.
You said you concentrate, Mr. Hawkins was, by the way, I've moved the admission of Exhibit 262 at this point.
No objection. It is received.
All right. You said you concentrated most of your efforts on the other forest road because that's where Mr. Hawkins had believed the body was buried?
Yes.
All right. What types of things did you do?
A lot. We did several cadaver dog searches, as you've heard testimony of the human remains detection dogs. We did some bulldozing in an area that Mr. Hawkins seemed to favor. We brought a botanist from UW Stevens Point to help us look at plant growth and what kind of plant growth we would be looking at, or we would be able to skip an area because the plant growth there was older than 4 years. We did line searches with other law enforcement personnel. We did soil probing.
Let's stop there. What's a line search?
It's essentially a bunch of police officers standing shoulder to shoulder, just walking through the woods. Where there was an area where we found a large rock, we would use a soil probe, which is essentially a hollow piece of metal, and plunge that into the ground and bring it up, and we'd be able to look at the soil to see if it had been disturbed. We had two different, a National Guard airplane, and I can't recall the source of the other, but two different flyovers with thermal imaging technology. So we did a lot. In addition, because we had information from Mr. Hawkins that a vehicle had passed them on that forest road, we placed flyers along in the Townsend area, in the Wabeno area, with a generic photograph of a Jeep Grand Cherokee asking, did you see this vehicle in 2010, in hopes that it was a local hunter who might recall that and be able to lead us in the right direction.
And despite all of those, excuse me, despite those efforts, you were not able to locate Stephanie Lowe's body.
We were not.
Did you do anything to try and verify what Andrea Wadinsky and Richard Hawkins had told you?
Yes.
Now, did Ms. Wadinsky told you about going to the store location?
Yes.
And did you do anything to try to confirm that she had in fact gone there and purchased things that day?
I did.
What did you do?
I contacted the store gas station. I gave them the date and the time of the purchase, and they were able to give me a receipt, which I believe was previously marked as an exhibit, that showed fuel purchases at 2 separate gas pumps.
And did you also obtain her debit card information?
Yes.
And did that match the receipt that you obtained from the store?
Yes.
And where is the store located?
Yes.
That's a chain, correct?
Yes.
All right. And that's the name of it, right?
Right.
It's like a convenience store, gas station?
Yes.
Okay. For those of us not from the Wausau area, where is the one that we're talking about located?
It's in the Weston area off of Camp Phillips Road.
All right. I want you, I'm going to take this down for a bit, and I'm going to put up previously identified and admitted as Exhibit 87A, which is the large size diagram of the cell phone call made by the defendant, or a series of calls actually, between 7:34 and 7:43 a.m. You see that?
Yes.
All right. What I'd like you to do, I've got a marking pen here, and I'd like you, if you can, if it's on this diagram, to mark on there with the letter A, and then right below that letter, write the store, if it's on this diagram. If you can. And then could you just write under there the store? Thank you. And that location that you just marked on there is the location where Ms. Wadinsky's debit card was used at approximately 7:52 a.m. to purchase gasoline from 2 different pumps and 2 candy-related items?
Yes.
Now, did you also, based on the information that you had from Ms. Wadinsky and Mr. Hawkins, attempt to locate a hardware store near Wabeno?
Yes.
And were you able to do that?
Yes.
And where was that hardware store located?
In Townsend, Wisconsin, which is just next to Wabeno.
And did you drive from Ms. Wadinsky's, Yvonne Wadinsky's cabin to that location?
Yes.
Approximately how long did it take to get from the cabin to that hardware store?
Approximately 10 minutes.
And were you able, and I know we're going to likely hear from a couple of people about this tomorrow, were we able to confirm that a shovel was purchased that morning
Yes.
of October 10th?
Yes.
Now, armed with all of this information, did you then recontact the defendant?
We did.
And was that in September of 2014?
Yes.
And you went to see him?
We did.
And did you attempt to get from him one last time to try and get him to tell you about what happened?
Yes.
And as a result of that meeting, did you make arrangements to have him come back to the Wausau area?
At his request, yes, we did.
And it was his request to come back here?
Yes, it was.
And then did you make arrangements for him to go back up to the Wabeno area?
Once again, at his request, yes, we did.
And when did you, how many times did he go back, did he go up to Wabeno with you in September of 2014?
2 times.
And as he was going up and back, was that recorded?
Yes.
And was there conversation off and on during that trip?
Yes.
And did you retain a copy of that of the recording?
Yes.
Mark this. $263. This kind of. Yeah, first Your Honor. Showing you it's been marked for identification as Exhibit 263. Is that a copy of the recording to and from Wabeno?
Yes.
And I believe the total of that is a little over 6 hours. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
For everybody's convenience, we're not going to play the whole thing, I guarantee you. But I would move the admission of Exhibit 263.
No objection to 263. Okay, it is received.
I have a smaller portion of it, however, I do want to play. You've listened to this whole recording at various times, correct?
Oh, yes.
And you're familiar with the portion that we're going to play, correct?
Yes.
All right. And Detective Holtz, during that portion, is there a discussion? We'll need to switch to the computer, Madam Clerk. Thank you. Is there discussion during that portion about concern for Eric Mahomes?
Yes.
What's said about that? Just briefly.
The defendant implies that one person that he does feel sorry for is Eric Mahomes, namely because he had heard that Alyssa and Stephanie had gotten the drugs and bagged the drugs up while he was in custody, and he didn't understand why he had been charged with the crime of possessing the crack cocaine while he was in custody.
Was there also some discussion about whether or not he was involved in the death of Stephanie Lowe?
Yes,
Did he make some comments about that?
he did.
What did he say?
One of the things he said was, not everybody in this is an angel. to which I replied that I was aware of that. And he also commented on this intentional thing, though. You understand why I have a hard time with this intentional homicide.
And did he say that he did not intentionally take Stephanie Lowe's life?
Yes.
Did he then define for you what he understood as being intentional?
Yes.
What did he say?
His version of intentional was pre-planned, that it had to be something that happened prior to going to a residence.
Why don't we play this? Yes.
Eric Mahomes, because the one that was in the house at the time she came up missing, when it's stuck his friend.
The one who was Andrea watched?
Yeah.
Alyssa?
Yeah. She told Andrew that her and Stephanie went and got the house with the dope from Labo
Yeah.
while Eric was locked up.
Right. Yeah.
And then, but he got charged for it.
Well, he knew about it.
Oh, he
Yeah,
knew? I just heard that's what Andrew told me. Alyssa told Andrew something. That's supposed to be about right. For them to just
Well, I mean, the reality of the situation, you know, it was a regular occurrence. It's not like it just happened that one time.
tell him drugs.
Well, Eric wasn't locked up. Eric took responsibility for that.
Yeah, he did.
I mean, I get what you're saying about the drugs on hand, but it was more of a conspiracy thing because it had been going on for a long time before he got locked up. But I feel bad for him too.
There's not, you know, everybody's not Angela is that he said it's the video in the situation.
I know.
I'm not saying whatever everything was out is right, you know, it's not.
I know. And we fully understand that. Investigating the case for as long as we have. If there ever comes a day when you're ready to sit down and just be, you know, I'm hoping that tomorrow you can get some closure for Stephanie's family, but
What you want to say, though?
I don't want to sound selfish, but we'd also like to put some of those pieces together.
Did you eventually get up to the Wabeno area on that trip?
Yes.
And that, was it late at night by the time you got there?
It was dark.
And was he able to locate for you the area where he believed Stephanie Lowe was buried?
Yes, he was.
And was it on the forest road that Mr. Hawkins had led you to?
No,
It was on the other one?
it was.
And that night, were you able to complete any searches for the body?
No.
Your Honor, I don't know if the court wants to take a break now. It's about 2:30, or if you want me to just keep going. It's up to, it doesn't matter to me.
Okay, well, we're going to probably take one 15-minute break this afternoon, so I don't know, 15 minutes, we go 15 minutes more before we take the break?
My direct is going to be more than 15 more minutes.
Right,
So.
I'm just,
This particular lawyer needs a break right now.
okay. We'll give everyone a break, 15 minutes.